If you feel anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you feel completely out of control. That's the essence of a clinical panic attack. Someone who is anxious but doesn't know what he or she feels anxious for. So in this state of loneliness, disconnectedness, lack of meaning making and purpose, and free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression, this is the state where a human being is most vulnerable for propaganda. In the end stage of mass formation, people become so intolerant for dissident opinions that even mothers report their children to the state if they think they are not loyal enough to the state narrative, and the other way around, children report their parents to the state. That's typical of totalitarianism. It always starts from a pseudo-scientific belief that we can create a new society which will be a paradise for a human being, and a being that lives forever and that doesn't suffer anymore, which lives forever in a biochemically induced state of eternal happiness. That's what transhumanists believe. And that's the ideology, I think, that threatens to seize control of society. It would be easy to believe that the dividing line, the border between good and evil runs between people, but that we all know that in the end, the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human being's heart. That the real crisis we find ourselves in this society is not a climate crisis, it's not a terrorism crisis, it's not the Ukraine crisis, it's not the Me Too crisis or the Corona crisis, it's a crisis of truth. And what we have to rediscover as a society is exactly the art of truth speech, the art of sincere speech, and even a limited number of people pursuing sincerity in a determined and perseverant way will be capable of breaking the power of the most impressive propaganda machinery the world has ever seen.
Vă salut, dragi prieteni! Pe drept cuvânt, încântat de revedere. Invitatul meu de astăzi este un invitat surpriză, profesorul Matthias Deschmet, de la Universitatea din Gent, profesor de psihologie, un foarte faimos profesor care și-a câștigat reputația în ultima vreme prin teoriile dezvoltate în materie de psihologie a mulțimilor, teorii utilizate pentru explicația reacțiilor colective în recenta experiență numită covidiană. Atât de faimos încât a fost invitat la numeroase discuții și talk show-uri de prestigioase gazde precum Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson sau James Corbett. Motiv în plus să fiu foarte, foarte onorat să-l am astăzi ca oaspete. Professor Matthias Deschmet, thank you very much for your presence, for accepting my invitation. I'm very honored and grateful.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You told me that your first trip in Bucharest. How was your conference?
Oh, it was. I think there was a very nice atmosphere at the conference, and also the building was very impressive. I heard it is the second largest parliament building in the world.
The second largest building in the world after the Pentagon building.
Pentagon, yes. So, as I said, what is more important, I think, is that the atmosphere at the conference was very good.
And how was the Romanian public as compared with your ordinary audience?
They were very enthusiastic, I think I'm very happy to see how many people here are aware of what is going on. Of course, Romanian people know better than most people in Western Europe what totalitarianism is all about, and they probably recognize it better now as it is emerging again in our society. While people in Western Europe, most people, just don't notice anything.
As you probably know that Romania has the second lowest COVID vaccination rate in European Union.
I know.
As specialist in psychology of the crowds. How could you explain that?
That's a good question. I heard that Hungary has the lowest vaccination rate.
No, Bulgaria. Bulgaria.
Okay, Bulgaria. Okay. Yes, that's a good question. Why? It has always been a question as to why certain countries fell prey to so-called mass formation and totalitarianism, and others didn't. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Hannah Arendt, and her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. I think
used in your recent book, yeah.
Yes, I refer to her.
A lot of references.
Yes, I refer to that work, The Origins of Totalitarianism of Hannah Arendt, and to also the banality of evil. There's other book of her, other famous book. She also wonders in that book, like, why during the Second World War certain countries fell prey to totalitarianism and others didn't, like Denmark didn't. And it could be that Bulgaria also didn't fall prey to it. I'm not sure. Certain countries in a strange way proved immune to totalitarianism and Nazi ideology, while others very easily fell prey to it. And it's very hard to explain. It's very hard to explain. Like indeed the situation now in which you mentioned that people here and then in Romania and in Bulgaria, usually chose not to be vaccinated. Yeah, that's a sign that in one way or another they're
very skeptical.
They were skeptical, yes, and they could take a critical distance of the narratives that were flourishing everywhere and that got society in their grip. I wish it would have been the same in Belgium, but it wasn't.
But in my view, taking such a critical distance is the key explanation of such a result.
Yes,
and our skepticism.
That's exactly
regarding the authority.
Yeah, that's exactly what disappears, of course. Like as soon as people are in this typical group dynamic to which I refer as mass formation, they are incapable of taking a critical distance, and that's logical. As soon as you understand the psychological mechanisms at work in mass formation and in totalitarianism, you see why people cannot take a critical distance anymore. Like, do we have time to describe this dynamic?
Please, you are very famous thanks to your theory of mass formation articulated during the COVID, so-called COVID pandemic. A theory based, if I'm not wrong, on 4 main pillars. The first one, loneliness. The second one, lack of individual meaning. Free-floating anxiety and free-floating frustration and aggression. Could you, for the Romanian friends who are not familiar with your writings and your conferences, could you explain, first of all, what the definition of mass formation, first of all, secondly, what the connection between mass formation and the authoritarian policies applied during COVID regimes, and finally, these main pillars of your theory?
Yes, I can, I think. Well, mass formation is actually, it's a kind of group formation. It's a formation of a group, a very specific group, which has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. Like, as soon as an individual is in the grip of mass formation, it typically cannot take a critical distance anymore of what the group believes in. It goes along with the group narrative, even if this group narrative becomes utterly absurd. That's just one strange thing. And a second very specific effect at the level of individual functioning is that someone who is in the grip of mass formation typically is willing to radically self-sacrifice. It is as if he is no longer aware of his own personal interests. That like we've seen it in the Soviet Union, for instance, where the communist leaders who were sentenced to death by Stalin, usually without any good reason, they just accepted the sentence, and they just said, like, well, if that's something that I can do for the Communist Party, then I will be happy to do so. Like that, it is this strange willingness to self-sacrifice, which is also a very typical characteristic of mass formation. And then thirdly, a third characteristic, or the third typical effect of mass formation on individuals, is that they become radically intolerant for people with a different opinion. And this goes quite far.
Including the dissident opinions.
Yes, absolutely. In particular, the dissident opinions. And this goes so far that in the end stage of mass formation, people become so intolerant for dissident opinions that even mothers report their children to the state if they think they are not loyal enough to the state narrative. And the other way around, children report their parents to the state. I've had this conversation with a woman, Shoref Eshtari, who lived in Iran during the revolution in Iran of 1978, and she described how she had witnessed how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the noose, the rope, around his neck when he was on the scaffold, and when he died, she claimed to be a heroine for what she did. That's typically the end stage of mass formation. It shows the level of intolerance towards everyone who thinks differently, even if it concerns their own children. So that are like the typical phenomenological characteristics of mass formation. And then, like this phenomenon has actually existed all as long as mankind exists. In medieval times, we've had the Crusades, we've had the witch hunts, which were typical examples of mass formation in medieval times.
But sorry for interrupting you.
No problem.
A similar story could be found even in communist regimes or in Nazi regimes.
Yeah, yes, definitely. From the 19th century onwards, from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, the mass formations became stronger and stronger and stronger, until they became so strong that the masses, led by certain leaders, and that was the first time in history, could seize control of the state apparatus, and in this way, a completely new kind of state emerged in the 20th century, which didn't exist before, which is the totalitarian state. People often confuse totalitarian states with classical dictatorships, but they are completely different. In a classical dictatorship is based on a very simple, primitive psychological mechanism. The population is just scared of the aggressive potential of a small group of people, dictatorial regime, and for that reason they just accept that the small group of people unilaterally imposes its social contract to society. That's, in a nutshell, and a little bit simplistic, what a classical dictatorship is. But in a totalitarian regime, something different happens at the psychological level, completely different. In a totalitarian regime, first, there is a process of mass formation. This means a process in which a certain part of the population, usually 20 to 30%, starts to believe fanatically in a certain ideology or a certain narrative, so fanatically that they are prepared to snitch on everyone, to report everyone to the state, as I just described, who doesn't go along with the narrative. And that leads to a state system which has a much more devastating and suffocating impact on the population than a classical dictatorship, because this totalitarian state has a huge secret police at its disposal, namely this part of the population who goes along with the state narrative. So that it is this combination of a fanatic belief in the population, in a certain part of the population, and leaders who excessively use propaganda and indoctrination to keep this part of the population in this state of fanatic belief. It is this combination of the two, which Hannah Arendt called the diabolic pact of a totalitarian state, that is the essence and the backbone, psychological backbone of totalitarianism, of a totalitarian state.
Professor Desmet, 1 second. It's important to note that your theory about mass formation is the backbone you mentioned of your recent book, or your famous book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. The first element, I forget to mention that. But getting back to your distinction between classical dictatorship and totalitarian regime, could you explain in details this distinction?
Yes, yes, I think I can.
Because you told me before our meeting, you told me that Ceaușescu's regime, it was a classic dictatorial regime.
Maybe.
Yeah. Why not?
It depends. It depends. Different scholars often use slightly different definitions of what totalitarianism is. But I tend to agree with Hannah Arendt that a real totalitarian system always is ideologically based. That's so typical for real totalitarianism, that it uses a pseudo-scientific theory to create, of which it believes that using this theory, it will be capable to create a new society, which will be a paradise for the human being. That's so typical for totalitarianism. And in this respect, you have to see totalitarianism as part of a much larger historical, cultural phenomenon, which is the emergence of a rationalist, materialist view on man in the world. That's very important. That's one of the main topics of my book, actually, that totalitarianism is not a historical coincidence. It emerged as part of the emergence of the materialist, rationalist view on man in the world. Like in a materialist, rationalist view on man in the world, we believe that the entire universe and the human being is like a huge machine, a set of elementary particles, molecules and atoms, which all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics and which can be perfectly understood, controlled and manipulated in a rational way. The universe is a machine, the human being is a small machine in the large machine, and if we study human being deeply enough, we will once be capable of completely understanding rationally how the human brain, how the human being, how the human machine works. And then, from the 19th century onwards, we saw these philosophers who believed that our rational knowledge would once be complete or almost complete, and that we would be capable of eliminating all suffering from human life, that the human being would live forever. In a nutshell, that the human being would become godlike, would inherit on the basis of its rational understanding divine capacities of creation and destruction. That's something that is now literally articulated by people such as Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah.
And I think that and that's typical of totalitarianism. It always starts from a pseudo-scientific belief that we can create a new society which will be a paradise for the human being. That's what the Nazis believed. That's what Stalin believed, starting from a different theory, but they believe the same. And I think that that's so typical for the situation we find ourselves in now. There are again people who believe that a technocratic, transhumanist ideology will be capable of creating a new paradise for the human being, a society which is no longer chaotic, which is strictly regulated through surveillance, in which society is transformed into an internet of bodies, as they call it, and we will saturate the human blood with nanoparticles and the brain with microchips, and in this way we will be capable of transforming the human being in a being that lives forever and that doesn't suffer anymore, which lives forever in a biochemically induced state of eternal happiness. That's what transhumanists believe, and that's the ideology, I think, that threatens to seize control of society. And that's so. And in this respect, it's a fully fledged, purely totalitarian state system that threatens to emerge now, I think.
And from this perspective, it's appropriate to say that COVID authoritarian regimes, or the biosecurity state, as Giorgio Agamben put it, is the biggest mass formation in the mankind's history?
Absolutely. There has never been a global mass formation. There has never been a mass formation which was a global, which the entire world was in the grip of. And now we have seen that. It's the first time in history.
So your theory that for the first time in history, we are witnessing the creation of a mass formation as a precondition for a totalitarian global
yes, definitely
regime.
Definitely.
And sorry.
No, go ahead.
This is why your book has been banned in Belgium.
I think the University of Gent banned my book because they felt under huge public pressure. That's what I think. I think I was national television and mainstream newspapers in Belgium very heavily criticized me that I was a liar, that I was an extreme right-wing
conspirationist.
Yes, conspiracist and a dictator at university, an indoctrinator of his students, and so on and so on. They tried to put me in a bad daylight in every possible manner on national television and in the mainstream newspapers. And I think that the University of Gent was just scared and that they didn't dare to just let me continue to use this book in my classes at university. And I think they regretted actually that they banned my book, because I think they know that it was not very clever what they did, because they banned my book because there would have been errors and sloppiness in the book. But they refused to send me a list with the errors. And I asked it repeatedly, like, send me the list with the errors in my book. And they refused to do so. They said I should find the errors on the internet, because many people had indicated the errors in my book, they said. But it's impossible for me to read all the reviews of my book on Amazon alone. There were 1,300 reviews published, I think. And I don't see why a university would rely on something that they find on the internet. If a university bans a book, they should say themselves, specify themselves why they banned the book, and that's what they refused to do up until now.
But getting back to the main pillars of your theory, it's very interesting that the starting point of your theory is based on the mass psychology, and more interestingly, that the starting point is related to the individual psychology. Yeah. As I said, the free-floating anxiety, the free-floating, as you call it, aggression, and free-floating frustration. Could you develop these ideas, please?
Yes. I think that's very important, because it's the essence of my theory, I think. And
this is why I asked.
Exactly. Yes. So, one of the somewhere back in 2017, I started to think about the topic of totalitarianism, long before the corona crisis. And I always wondered, why did totalitarianism emerge for the first time in the 20th century? And what is the difference with the classical dictatorship? And both questions are answered in the same way, I think. Totalitarianism emerged for the first time in the 20th century because the mass formations became stronger and stronger throughout the last few hundreds of years. And the mass formations became stronger and stronger because there was more and more loneliness. And the loneliness became stronger and stronger because of our rationalist view on man in the world and the industrialization of the world. So we have this chain of events, I think, a logical or causal chain of events. A few centuries ago, we started to consider life in a more and more rationalist way. So believing that the rational understanding, in the end, should be the guiding principle of individual human life and of society, human living together. In itself, rational thinking is, of course, very good, but the belief that the essence of life can be reduced to rational understanding, that's something else. That's not scientific at all, for instance, because all major scientists concluded that no matter how long you study a phenomenon in a rational way, in the end, the essence of the phenomenon will always transcend rational understanding. And something like complex dynamical systems theory even showed this in a baffling way. They showed that every complex dynamical system in nature, in the end, behaves as an irrational number. But no matter how much scientists declared that the essence of life transcends rationality, we see that this rationalist viewman in the world gained power throughout the last 300 of years and became dominant. And this rationalist viewman in the world had several consequences. It led to the industrialization of the world, to the excessive mechanization of the world, and to the excessive use of technology. And that I explained it in the first chapters of my book. I explained the psychological mechanisms behind it. I won't do this now because it would lead us too far, it would take us too much time. But it was that led to a state in which the human being found itself more and more disconnected from other human beings and from its natural environment. And this disconnected, lonely state, which is often referred to as the atomized state, people as Hegel, Hannah Arendt, the Frankfurter Schule, call that the atomization of society, the fact that human beings start to become like atoms which do not vibrate anymore with the rest of society. And once people are in this lonely state, they will typically be confronted with lack of meaning making and purpose in life. And that's extremely clear. Just before the corona crisis, over 40% of the world population declared to feel lonely, to not have one meaningful relationship with someone else. And over 50% reported that they considered their own job, for instance, a bullshit job, which means a job without purpose and meaning. So you see the combination of the two increased. So this loneliness and this lack of meaning making and purpose in life increased throughout the last few hundreds of years. And just before the corona crisis, it peaked. It had never been as high. And then a second consequence or the next consequence of once people feel lonely and disconnected, they will typically be confronted with what I call free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression in which people don't know what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for, which is extremely aversive. If you feel anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you feel completely out of control. That's the essence of a clinical panic attack. Someone who is anxious but doesn't know what he or she feels anxious for. So in this state of loneliness, disconnectedness, lack of meaning making and purpose, and free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, this is the state where a human being is most vulnerable for propaganda. If
that's perfectly understandable, but all these feelings are individual feelings. But from this point to the collective feeling, there is a distance between these 2 points to be covered.
Yes, I think that's an extremely important question. Like, how do we go from the individual level and the level of individual psychology to the level of collective psychology? And that's something that I think is explained in detail in my book. Like, once individuals are confronted with this loneliness, lack of meaning making, free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, if a lot of individuals are in this state, something very specific might happen. If under these conditions, a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, then the following might happen. All this free-floating anxiety in individuals might connect to the object of anxiety represented in the narrative.
And the object of the anxiety being?
For instance, a virus, or the Jews in the Second World War, or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union, or the witches during the witch hunts, or the Muslims during the Crusades, and so on. So it's always the same. A population is in a very specific state, and then a narrative is distributed, providing an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, for instance, lockdowns, or concentration camps, or gulags, or witch hunts, doesn't matter. And then all this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety, and people might be willing to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, no matter how absurd the strategy is, just because it gives them a feeling of psychological control. They felt out of control because they didn't know what they were anxious for, and now they feel in control again. They have this object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with it. And that's a strange thing.
And more than that, a kind of solidarity.
And of course, that's the next step. That's the
Next
next
step.
step, yes. Because, first, all the free-floating anxiety connects to the object of anxiety. And then, because so many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, people have the feeling of fighting a heroic collective battle with the object of anxiety, with the virus, for instance. And that's what makes them feel connected again. So they feel as if they can escape their loneliness and as if their life has a new purpose and meaning. So it seems as if they got rid of all their problems. They have their anxiety is coupled to an object. They have a new purpose and meaning. And all their anxiety, frustration, and they can take out their frustration and aggression on the object of anxiety. And this state leads to a kind of that gives an intoxicating mental effect, which is technically speaking exactly the same as hypnosis.
Could you explain a little bit the role of the mass media on this mass formation?
Oh yes, it's
you have two. I would say two pillars on explaining the step between the individual feelings to a collective feeling, and these two pillars are the science on one side, and on the other side the media. The science becoming too dominant, as you said.
The emergence of mass media at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century actually was a necessary factor in the emergence of totalitarianism. Because without mass media, you can never create a mass formation that lasts very long. Like, as I said, there has always been mass formation. It exists as long as the human being exists. But the mass formation usually didn't last very long. And this changed with the introduction of mass media in several respects. The modern masses are different from the ancient masses because they are lonely masses, so-called lonely masses. Like in ancient times, people had to meet physically, in person, in order for a mass formation to be able to emerge. But now, in modern times, people can perfectly be sitting isolated from each other, each in their living rooms.
And virtually.
Yes, but if they are infused with the same ideas and narratives, they will all be in the grip of the same mental representations and the same narratives, and they will become a mass, even if they are all isolated and lonely in their living rooms. And it is these so-called lonely masses, a term which was coined by Jacques Ellul, if I'm not mistaken, someone who wrote a wonderful book on propaganda. These lonely masses can be much better controlled than the physical masses of ancient times, and they can last much longer. They can last decades. The mass formations can last decades, which is necessary if you want to use a mass formation as the basis of a state system. If a mass formation lasts only a few weeks, you can never use it to base a new state system on. But if you can make a mass formation continue for several years, even several decades, then then you can use this stable, lonely mass as the backbone of a state system. And that's what happened in the 20th century. So you can never create a lonely mass formation without mass media. So the mass media are crucial.
Yeah, and the science. I remember during the interview with James Corbett, you developed a theory based on the distinction between the rational approach and irrational one.
Yes.
Could you develop this idea a little bit more?
The core and essence of life always transcends rational understanding. You can never grasp the essence of life in the categories of rational understanding. That's something that all major scientists concluded. And someone like Einstein, for instance, said, and it's wonderful, in the preface of a book of Max Planck, he said, many people think that science is created by logical and rational thinking. He said, but I don't think that's true. The essence of scientific understanding is not rational understanding. It's Einfühlung, a German term which means as much as empathical feeling, empathical resonance. So what Einstein claimed was that the origin and the source of new scientific theories is an extraordinary capacity in a scientist not to think rationally, but to empathically resonate with the object or the phenomenon he is investigating. That's wonderful. And many other scientists said exactly the same. René Thom, for instance, said the same, independently of Einstein. Niels Bohr has this wonderful statement. He said, after studying, so Niels Bohr is a famous physicist who received the Nobel Prize for his investigation of elementary particles, of atoms. And he said, I will summarize it in a nutshell, he said, when it comes to atoms, language can only be used as poetry, with which he said you cannot rationally understand this extremely strange and, from a rational perspective, absurd behavior of elementary particles. You need poetry to describe it and to resonate with it. And so that's science, on the one hand, is an accumulation of rational knowledge. It is. But at the same time, it's also a wonderful epistemological practice which shows time and time again that the essence of life escapes rationality, transcends rational understanding. And it's exactly the same. Science comes to exactly the same conclusions as, for instance, the samurai culture in Japan. The people who, when a student started training in the martial arts in Japan, he first went to an extremely long stage of technical rational training, where he learned for almost every situation on the battlefield how you should move your body, how you should use your weapons, and so on, in a strictly technical, rational way. But, the samurai said, it's very difficult, they said, to learn the techniques of the martial arts. But it's even more difficult to forget them again. And if you do not succeed in forgetting them again, before you go to the battlefield, you will die on the battlefield. You should not think of technique at the battlefield. They intended to say that technical and rational training is not an end in itself. It should lead to something that transcends technicality and rationality. It should lead to a certain intuition, a certain feeling, a certain resonance with the battlefield and with reality around you. That's the end stage of the training of the samurai. And the end stage of the training of a scientist should also not be rational understanding. It should be a certain empathical resonance with the phenomenon you investigate, a certain feeling with them, a certain something that the ancient Greeks called techne, a kind of knowledge that transcends rationality. So that's what our culture should find out now. It should find out, we should start to understand as a culture what these major scientists meant when they said that the essence of life cannot be understood in a rational way. It means that we have to move on from rational knowing of the world to empathic, resonating knowledge of the world. And I think that's the revolution we have to go through now. And as a collective. And that's when we will get rid of the symptom of totalitarianism. And this will, in a very practical way, I think this boils down for the human being to master the art of resonating speech, of truth-telling, which is the real solution for the problem of rationalism and loneliness.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your explanation. Getting back to the mass formation and the relationship between the masses and the establishment. I think this is a point, a very important point to be clarified, because And we will develop in a couple of minutes even some critics against your theory, because your chapter 8, if I'm not wrong, regards the elite. And you are saying in this chapter that the leaders of mass formation are not conspirators, but those held captive by the controlling mechanistic ideology. What's in fact the role of the establishment in the mass formation? Because we have to explain their position and the position of the establishment.
Yes, I don't know if I said that the leaders are not conspirators. I think I said that the leaders usually fall prey to the mass hypnosis themselves as well. I think, but and of course,
more than that, you said that the media itself is a victim of
yes, of course.
of such hypnosis.
Yes. People conspire, and conspiracies have always existed, and they exist now as well. Of course, you cannot ignore that. Everyone who is not completely blind see that people show the tendency to conspire, but I don't think it's the ultimate explanation for what happens. The ultimate explanation, I think, is a much more complex dynamical phenomenon in which the root cause of the problem is not a small evil elite who conspires, but a certain view on man in the world, a certain ideology, a certain way of thinking. And I think it's very important to be aware of that, because otherwise you might fall prey to the idea that the solution to the problem is the violent destruction of the small elite, which wouldn't change anything. This elite is the elite because the population made it the elite, and because in one way or another they represented the way of thinking that was successful.
So in your view, the destruction of this elite is not a solution?
It's not a solution, of course not. And that's a major difference between classical dictatorships and totalitarian systems. If in a classical dictatorship you destroy a certain substantial part of the dictatorial elite, the dictatorial regime, there is a good chance that the dictatorial system might collapse. If in a totalitarian system you destroy a part of you eliminate a part of the totalitarian elite, it is just replaced by other people. That's what Stalin was very well aware of. He knew he could perfectly eliminate 50-60% of his communist leaders. They would just be replaced by someone else, and the system would continue as it did, because the point of gravity of the system is rather situated in the masses than in the elite, and in the ideology, of course. That's something extremely important.
But you said at the beginning that Stalin represented a classical dictatorship.
No, a totalitarian state. Yes. Stalin was really a totalitarian leader.
And Ceaușescu?
I have to be very careful when I talk about Ceaușescu as an example. I don't think he's a pure totalitarian leader. I think he was closer to, in many respects, to a classical dictator than to a totalitarian leader. But I don't know the case of Ceaușescu and Romania well enough to make statements in a determined way about it. So I will be. I will admit my lack of knowledge on.
I wouldn't say that, but let's clarify for our friends the role of the establishment in your theory.
Yes, it's part of the problem. It's important. I described a few minutes ago or about 20 minutes ago how the materialist view on man in the world and the rationalist view on the man in the world put the population in this new state, this very lonely state, lack of meaning, making, lack of purpose, and so on. But a similar or a very important other process that happened, starting from the French Revolution onwards, was the emergence of a new elite. A new elite, which like before the French Revolution, the elite existed of the clergy and the noblemen. And these people just imposed their will to the population without explaining it or without justifying it. They just said that is what will happen and that is how it happened. And the population accepted that because they just were in the grip of this religious view on man in the world, which stated that God created certain people to command and others to obey, and nobody really believed that, but they did as if it was true, and that was how society functioned at that moment. And then, when this dogmatic religious view on man in the world slowly collapsed and was replaced by the rationalist view on man in the world, I'm definitely not against religion, but I believe that institutionalized dogmatic religion, as it happened before the French Revolution, indeed was problematic. And when it was replaced by the materialist, rationalist view on man in the world, there was no ground anymore. There was no arguments anymore to be found in this rationalist view on man in the world, which the elite could use to just overtly impose their will to the population. And so they were confronted with a problem. The leaders had to be democratically elected. And to be elected, they had to find out what the population wanted and then give them a little bit what they wanted, or otherwise they would not be re-elected. So the leaders actually became followers. Rather than imposing their will to the population imposed their will to them. And if you read all the works of the founding fathers of modern propaganda, such as Bernays, Lippmann, Trotter, they all say the same. They all start from the same problem. The leaders cannot impose their will anymore to the population, so they lose control. And if we do not want to fall prey to the destructive tendencies in the population, they said, we will have to find a solution. And they found a solution. They said, if we cannot impose our will anymore to the population, we have only one option. We have to let the population do what we want without them knowing that they do what we want, which means we have to manipulate them constantly. And people often forget that. But immediately after the French Revolution, when the religious regime collapsed, we saw the emergence of the first institute of propaganda. The church used propaganda, but it was of a completely different nature. Immediately after the French Revolution,
secular propaganda.
The first institute of propaganda was established, the Bureau d'Opinion Publique in France. And after that, propaganda became always more important. The leaders relied more and more on manipulation to keep control of society. And the Second and First World War became much more important. And between the world wars, it didn't disappear. It was used in times of peace, by Bernays, to make people buy products produced by mass production. And then in the Second World War, it became even much more important. And after the Second World War, it continued to become more important. And now we live in a public space which is constantly saturated with propaganda without people knowing it. That's what people like Herbert Marcuse called a velvet glove totalitarianism. Like in the Western world, he said, we actually live in a totalitarian system, he said, already, but people do not know it. It's the most perfect totalitarianism, where people think they are free,
because of the propaganda.
But actually do perfectly what other people want without knowing it. So I don't know if I agree with that. In my book, I say that we are on the verge of lapsing into a new kind of technocratic totalitarianism. I don't think I would say that we were already in a totalitarian state, but we were close to it, and all the propaganda was there. The only thing we needed was a new narrative, which was successful in coupling all the free-floating anxiety and making people go along with a strategy to deal with it. And that's what happened in the Corona crisis, I think. And after that, the Ukraine crisis, the Middle East conflict now, you see time and time again how certain narratives seize control of society and can be used to steer the population in a certain direction.
Professor Desmet, as I said, your chapter 8 in your book seems to be the thorny topics of your theory exploited by your critics. And I will start with one of the most famous dissident of the Corona period, C.J. Hopkins, very famous writer, author of many theories about global global cap technocracy and the new normal, and who suffered recently a criminal punishment in Germany for associating swastika with the mask as autocratic symbols. And according to C.J. Hopkins, quote, in this mass formation fairy tale, the political conflict disappears. The totalitarian system and those who resist it are replaced by a psychiatrist and a psychiatric patient. In this story, according to C.J. Hopkins, there is no one and nothing to fight. We just need to find a treatment for this bizarre new psychiatric disorder. What's your position on his critic?
I don't know if you read my book.
I read your book.
Many people reacted in the same way after reading the criticism of Hopkins and also of the Brigands.
I have the Bragging.
Yes.
Bragging saying that your theory, and quote, is a cover-up of the elites, and the globalists responsible for the worst outcomes inflicted on humanity during the pandemic. So your theory being a cover-up. And there was no reason to invent or apply a new concept like mass formation to explain the misery, apathy, and docility seen in the general population and even among our colleagues.
Yes, well, many people reacted in the same way as I did, I think, when I read the criticism. I responded to the criticism, by the way. I published, I think, 2 essays on my Substack, where I responded to the major criticism I received from the Brigands, and then also to the criticism I received from the mainstream media and so on.
And I remember an interview Catherine Austin fits with Brigands, developing this critics on your theory.
I know. You know, the strange thing is, of course, I don't excuse the elite, and I mention literally in my book, like a mass formation cannot continue to exist if it is not constantly fed by propaganda and indoctrination through the mass media. I mentioned that in my book, but I think there's a difference between saying that the elite plays a role, an important role, and saying that the elite is responsible for a situation alone. This creates the illusion, I think, that the problem could be solved by, as I said, by destroying the elite, which is not true at all. This problem would not be solved, believe me.
But their critics are based on the fact that you're, according to their views, are ignoring the important role played by the evil elite.
Yes. I don't ignore it, definitely not. And I invited the Brigands to have a conversation with me publicly about that, because I would have explained them that I don't ignore it. But they refused to do so, which is a pity, I think. And I will also immediately tell that I respect the Brigands.
Maybe his wife.
Yes, maybe. Yes, I can try it. Maybe I'm more successful with his wife. Yes, but I immediately want to say that
his wife being co-author.
Yes, she is a co-author, yes. Yeah. I respect their work, and I think they did important work in exposing some of the crimes that were committed by the psychopharmaceutical industry, for instance. But and maybe I could even say that maybe I could have stressed the role played by the elite more and a little bit more. That's true, but that was just not the focus of my work at the moment. I focused on this phenomenon of mass formation, which is, of course, very true. The Brigands are not right at all when they say that you don't need that concept to explain what was happening. You definitely need it. It explains something essentially, and I did not invent it, as they suggest. Mass formation is a phenomenon that is studied since the 19th century by a series of scholars and authors. For me, it's strange that they seem to ignore a major part of my work. I talked so much about the diabolic pact between the masses and the elite, in which I think I show well enough that the elite plays a role and an important role, but I do not go along with this idea that all evil would be situated in the elite. I would recommend the brigands to read the work of Solzhenitsyn, his book you well know, I guess, the Gulag Archipelago, yes, where Solzhenitsyn says on a certain page that it would be easy to believe that the dividing line, the border between good and evil runs between people, but that we all know that in the end, the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human being's heart. In other words, we all have a little bit of evil in us, and it is not only the elite that is evil. And if there would be no evil in the population, they would never fall prey to propaganda and indoctrination of the elite. I think that the most important contribution we can make to solving the problem of totalitarianism exactly is trying to become aware of the way in which we contributed to it, becoming aware of the evil in ourselves, trying to get rid of that, and then we will make the most valuable contribution we can make to solving the problem of totalitarianism, by which I do not intend to say that the elite is not a problem. Of course it is a problem, and as I said, we have seen the emergence of this new elite, which uses more and more propaganda, and I repeated time and time again that exactly for that reason, that the real crisis we find ourselves in this society is not a climate crisis, it's not a terrorism crisis, it's not the Ukraine crisis, it's not the Me Too crisis or the Corona crisis, it's a crisis of truth. And what we have to rediscover as a society is exactly the art of truth speech, the art of sincere speech. That's what we have to rediscover, and you have to go from a society which is based on propaganda and indoctrination to a society which is centered on sincere speech. That's the big challenge. I don't know. I don't know if that's sufficient to say that I think the elite is a problem, but not the only problem.
It's not the only problem, but according to your critics, you have to be more balanced in criticizing.
Yes. That could. Yes. Why not? I mean, I'm open to that critic, and I think that I often thought that I could have added a chapter on propaganda and indoctrination in my book, which stressed that more. But I wrote that book in 4 months' time. I had to deal with the and it was very difficult for me, of course, as a university professor. I was to speak without being completely cancelled, and of course I was very careful and not to suggest too much that everything could be reduced to conspiracy and to an evil elite, which I still don't believe, but maybe I should have stressed it a little bit more. Yes. Well, I hope the brigands watch this and that they see and that
hopefully he will accept a debate with you
or a conversation, and and this way he might notice that I consider his criticism, but I try to learn something of it.
Professor Desmet, which are the solutions for the future? Because there are a lot of rumors about a potential new lockdown, a potential new virus, a potential new more policies of restrictions, a lot of debates, a lot of discussions about about the Great Reset, about the Sustainable Development Goals, 15-minute cities, climate change,
digital passports,
digital coins, digital passports, a lot of topics to be afraid of.
Yes, definitely.
And could you speak again about free-floating anxiety, about free-floating frustration, about free-floating... in 2 words, could we speak again about a new object of...
anxiety. Yes, unless you're completely blind, you can see that the global institutions such as the UN and the WHO prepare themselves to impose a technocratic system, a technocratic totalitarian system to the world. You see it at all levels that they are preparing for that, and they use a kind of pessimism in the population and society and in the elites about the possibility to counter what they consider major crisis with democratic means. They believe that they never will be capable to control climate change, for instance, in a democratic way. And that's indeed and that's why they want to introduce digital coins and digital IDs and all this stuff in the nearby future. And to do so, to convince the population to go along with that new state system and this new ideology, they will use all kinds of narratives, like the climate narrative
and the propaganda seems to be reinforced.
Yeah, yes, of course. And then the core ideology is represented by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, I think.
And you told me about the numbers of fact checking imposed by UN. And
yes, I wrote an essay on my Substack page about that. Like in 2020 alone, the UN recruited more than 110,000 so-called digital first responders, people who operate anonymously on the internet and who try to put everyone who goes against the UN ideology in a bad daylight. So it's huge. The propaganda apparatus used by the global institutions to impose, to coerce the population into conformism, into consent is huge, and I think it's clear that as you said, like you have to distinguish. We have to distinguish between ideology and narratives. Like usually, totalitarian leaders blindly believe in their own ideology. At this moment, the ideology that aspires totalitarian control is transhumanism and technocracy, I think. But to impose this ideology, to convince the population, to accept the ideological changes they want to make to society, they use all kinds of narratives. And very often, totalitarian leaders do not believe in the narratives they use. So they believe blindly and fanatically in their ideology. They are hypnotized by their own ideology, but not by their narratives. They know that the narratives are propaganda and often are not true. So that's what we will see, I guess. We clearly see that there are many people now who are at the level of the global institutions who want to impose a technocratic totalitarian system, and there's a very good chance that they will use new narratives now with new objects of anxiety to convince the population to accept it. That's true. And the solution, well,
the danger, danger is facing new propaganda, new narratives. And I'm your student in in your classes. And my last question, Professor Deschmet, what's my option? The solutions.
The solutions, yes. I'm writing a new book now about the psychology of truth, because I believe that from all perspectives, the better you analyze the problem we are facing now, the problem of propaganda, mass formation, totalitarianism, and so on, the more you see that sincere speech is a solution to the problem. And if you look at the phenomenon of mass formation, then you see that it's actually a symptomatic fake solution for the problem of loneliness. So more and more people started to feel atomized, lonely, disconnected, and that's why they fell prey to mass formation. And this mass formation seems to liberate them from their loneliness. It seems as if it reconnects people. They fight this heroic collective battle with the object of anxiety, and that makes them feel connected again. But in the end, it's a fake feeling. Because a mass is a group that emerges not because individuals connect to each other, but because each individual separately connects to the collective ideal. Meaning that in a mass, the famous solidarity in a mass is never a solidarity with other human beings. It's a solidarity with the collective ideal. And in the end, people feel much more solidarity with the collective or the state than with other human beings. And they decide to report each other to the state each time they think someone is not loyal enough to the state. So that's a strange thing. Mass formation seems to be a solution for loneliness, but it isn't. It isolates people even more and more and more. And now you can see very easily that sincere speech, which I will describe in a much more technical detail in my book, is at the same time a remedy for the symptom, because if a mass formation happens through propaganda, and there are people who do not fall prey to it and who continue to speak out in as sincere way as possible without trying to convince the people in the masses, but just living up to the ethical duty of articulating the words that seem sincere and honest to them, if there are people who continue to do so, then you see that the mass formation might not stop. But it won't go to the last stage, where the masses become convinced that it is their ethical duty to destroy each and every one who doesn't go along with them. That's the first thing. Sincere speech inhibits the symptom of mass formation. And at the same time, it's also the real solution, not the fake solution, the real solution for the problem of loneliness. Because psychologically speaking, sincere speech is a resonating speech. It's speech that connects people to each other. So, and someone like Gandhi realized this very well. He realized that the only way to resist extremely bureaucratic systems such as imperialist systems and totalitarian systems, that the only way to resist these systems from within is non-violent resistance, centered on sincere speech. If you read the autobiography of Gandhi, then you will see that it is titled Experiments on Truth. And what he says is that the essence of nonviolent resistance always is sincere speech. And his entire life, he practiced the art of sincere speech in a very simple way, almost naive way. He tried to become more honest and more sincere, admitting every time when he lied to himself, trying to be more honest, more sincere. And in this way, this guy, who said of himself that he had no major talents, he said, I'm not strong, physically strong, I was not handsome, I was not intelligent at school, I was not a good writer and not a good speaker, not at all. But this guy, without any major talent, succeeded in doing something even the largest army in the world couldn't do at that moment. He kicked out the English of India. And that's what you have to realize. The better you understand the psychology of totalitarianism, the better you see that it is a psychology of truth that will be a solution to it. Speaking in a very insincere way, practicing this art is something we can all do. And if we do it, we will inherit the same power of Gandhi and of other people who spoke in a sincere way. That's how even a limited number of people pursuing sincerity in a determined and perseverant way will be capable of breaking the power of the most impressive propaganda machinery the world has ever seen. That's what I think we should realize.
I'm very glad that your final conclusion and your final solution is the sincere speech for two reasons. First one, it sounds very optimistic. Secondly, you know the title of our podcast or my podcast? In Romanian is Drept Cuvânt, meaning honestly speaking.
Yeah,
very honestly speaking, Professor Desmet, I'm very grateful and thank you very much for your presence and for your kind presentations.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.